Good morning and welcome to Emerald Ash Borer University. This is Robin Usborne from Michigan State University. My EAB University colleagues are Professors Cliff Sadoff and Elizabeth Barnes from Purdue University and Amy Stone from Ohio State University Extension. And today we are happy to share with you the presentation entitled Invasive Jumping Worms, the Impact of a New Soil Invader, presented by Bradley Herrick from the University of Wisconsin Madison Arboretum. Brad holds a BA in biology from Luther College and an MS in ecosystems studies from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He is the ecologist and research program manager at the UW Madison Arboretum. His research interests include plant community ecology, invasion biology, and environmental monitoring. Since 2013, he has been studying the effects of jumping worms on plant and soil interactions, susceptibility of habitats to invasion, and potential control mechanisms. We welcome your comments and questions today, so please feel free to type them in the chat pod or the Q&A pod. Brad will be answering them right after his presentation. Tomorrow, you will be emailed a link to a short, voluntary, confidential survey that we hope you will take the time to fill out. It helps us bring these free educational webinars to you. The email will also include our presenters' contact information, as well as information on how to obtain CEUs for viewing the live webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later on the EAB University page of the www.emeraldashborer.info website. Thank you all for attending today. And Brad, please unmute your mic and begin your presentation.
All right, well, Robin, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to Elizabeth as well for inviting me here today. Like Robin mentioned, I'm the ecologist at the Arboretum here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I've been recently working a lot with this new invasive species, the jumping worm. And so, without further ado, let's dive into the presentation here. Right when I say that, it's not going forward, so hang with me. There we go. Okay. So just a quick outline of what we're going to cover today together. I'm going to start off with some basic earthworm biology and ecology, and some of you that this will be review material. Some of it will be brand new, so bear with me if you've heard the story of earthworms before. We'll talk a little bit about how the earthworms affect the environment, how they change the environment. Spend quite a bit of time on earthworm identification, specifically how to identify jumping worms versus other earthworms that are very common in the soil. And then the bulk of the talk will be spent on jumping worms, a little bit of background, why they pose a concern to us, impacts to gardens, especially how they're spreading around the landscape, and then wrap up with what we can do. And then, as Robin mentioned, we'll have time for questions. And this photo here is of me as a 3-year-old digging for fishing worms in my grandpa's rose beds. And it's a little bit of a fuzzy picture, but I wasn't too pleased to be holding that common nightcrawler. And who would have not thought that I would have been holding a lot of these worms later in life? So earthworm biology. So earthworms are very simple organisms. They more or less do only a few things, but do them very well. They feed on soil and organic matter, primarily in the form of leaf litter usually. They are promiscuous, they are polygamous, hermaphroditic, but some can reproduce parthenogenically, meaning that they don't need a mate to reproduce. And that's the case with most jumping worms, definitely the ones that we have so far in North America. So broadly, earthworms are classified into 3 general functional groups. And these are primarily where in the soil profile they persist. So the first group we refer to as epigeic, which just means they dwell in the litter layer. So this is, amongst the leaves, the decaying organic matter on top of the soil. So they're not actually in the soil, they're just on top in that tasty organic layer. And then there's this intermediate functional group of earthworms in the topsoil, and they're called endogeic. So they're just below the leaf layer, but within the first few inches of topsoil. And the earthworms that we're going to be talking about today, the jumping worms, the species that we have in Upper Midwest are all in what's called the epiendogeic functional space. So they have the capacity to go down to the topsoil as well as spend time in that litter layer. So depending on environmental conditions, they can burrow down a few inches into the soil if need be. But that's the space that we're talking about with these jumping worms. And then finally, there's this subsoil dwelling group called the anisic group. And so these are one very common earthworm that you've all probably heard of is the common nightcrawler. And that's an example of one of these deep soil dwelling earthworms. They come to the surface, they collect leaf litter, and they pull it down into their burrow. And what's left, you can see in this photo, are the little stems, little petioles that they do not ingest. It's just the leaf matter itself. So what happens to the woods when we have earthworms coming in? And this is a time that I usually mention that in the Upper Midwest, any areas that was in the way of glaciers during the last ice age, there generally are no native earthworms found in those areas. And so, when we're talking about earthworms, in this part of the country, we're primarily, and this includes, Ohio, Indiana, Northern Illinois, we're referring to all earthworms are considered non-native. There are no native earthworms. There are a couple of aquatic earthworms that are the exception. When you get into the southern part of the country, then you start to pick up a lot of native earthworms. So our forests and our woods have evolved over time, over the last 10,000 or so years, without earthworms as part of the system. And so they are truly, not native to woodlands, and many of them tend to be very invasive. And so what happens on the left-hand side of the slide, you see kind of a natural, high-quality woodland where you don't have very many earthworms at all. And so what you have typically are discrete soil layers. You can really see where they change in terms of organic matter. All of the tree roots are under the soil or under this organic layer. You have a very thick, healthy leaf layer. It's also referred to as a duff layer. It's a very spongy, nutrient-rich, moisture-rich soil layer. And because of that, you get high plant diversity. So many plants, many different kinds of plants growing in that kind of forest. If you contrast that to the right-hand side of this graph, in woods that have been heavily invaded by earthworms, so you have a lot of earthworms and of all different functional groups, so deep soil dwellers and then those ones that are just on the surface layer, you see very little to no organic matter, no healthy leaf layer exists. And so you have buttressing roots of trees. As you can see here, the roots are exposed to the environment. You have very little, often little nutrients, little moisture for native plants to grow. So you often are left with just a few general woodland species and bare soil, or you see invasive species moving into that area that's been so disturbed. You see heavily mixing of soil. which we'll talk about later, can be beneficial in some environments, but not in native forests. And then soil compaction. So you have a lot of different things happening. The earthworms have come in and really changed the environment. And in this case, it's primarily a negative change in terms of woodland health and biodiversity. So I mentioned a little bit about changing to the soil environment. I'm not going to go through all these, but earthworms do a lot to change their environment. They will change their environment to suit their needs. That includes, through their different behaviors of burrowing, casting, how they feed, the mucus that they secrete from their glands. They can have effects on the physical structure of soil, the chemical nature of the soil, and the biological aspects of what's living in the soil, from invertebrates to plants to microorganisms. They really are environmental engineers. So there's your quick background on earthworm biology and ecology. So you're all experts now, and you can feel confident that you can explain to people what earthworms are and how they change their environment. Obviously, that could be a talk all in itself, and is university course is talking about soil organisms. But the real reason why you're here is to learn more about jumping worms. And so these, and usually when I give talks like this, before COVID, I would give these talks in person, and I would always ask the audience, who had heard of jumping worms, or who had seen them, had them in their yards, to get a sense for kind of the level of experience dealing with these invasive species. Can't do that now, but I'm guessing many of you have or are dealing with them in your yards or on places that you manage. If not, then this will be good information for you as well, obviously. So jumping worms are native to Asia. The ones that we have in upper Midwest, or the Midwest in general, are primarily from Japan and the Korean Peninsula. What's interesting in their native habitats, they're commonly found in grasslands, not as much in forests. We don't really know why that is, why we see the difference here in North America. We don't find them very often, if at all, in prairies or grasslands. There are hundreds of species and affiliated genera worldwide of these, what we call ferritomoid earthworms. They're a very big group, so we're just talking about a few species in that group. In Wisconsin, the first record was in 2013 here in Madison at the Arboretum. Wisconsin has a invasive species rule that's administered by our DNR. And so invasive species are categorized as prohibited or restricted. Prohibited is the more restrictive category, meaning that you, as a landowner or a commercial entity, you're not allowed to possess a given invasive species. Before we found these in Wisconsin, that was how these were listed. Once we found them and started doing surveys and discovered that they were much more widely dispersed than we had originally thought, and that there was no really good control that we could offer folks, we downlisted them to restricted, which really carries the same regulations, other than it's not unlawful to possess them because they're fairly ubiquitous now. But you're not allowed to sell them, knowingly transport them, those kind of things. So it is an effort to limit the spread. There are 3 general species that co-occur in the Midwest. These are Amenthus tokyoensis, Amenthus agrestis, and then one that is just changed to a different genus, Metaphyre hilgendorfi. They're all really similar looking. They do the same things. They live in the same functional space in the soil. but their sizes are different. Tokyoensis are the smaller earthworms from 3 to 5 inches, whereas Metafire can get upwards of 8 inches or more, so pretty large earthworms. And yeah, I just kind of said this, but all three are in that epiendogeeic space in the soil, and they're all parthenogenetic, so they can all reproduce readily without a mate. So this slide I want to spend some time on. This is where we're going to look at comparing the identification traits of a typical Amenthus on the left-hand side and a European earthworm called Lumbricus rubellus that's very common, but you might often find rubellus in the same soil area. So both these groups of earthworms are considered endoepigeic. So that's why I thought it's a good comparison, because you might find both these in the same soil area. So it's good to know what you're looking for and how to identify jumping worms versus this European earthworm. And really this, it goes for any European earthworm. This will help you decide if it's a jumping worm or any other kind of worm. So the first characteristic is just the length of the earthworm. And I've already told you that jumping worms can vary within that group. And so length is always kind of a tough characteristic to use, because individual organisms can vary in length due to microhabitat conditions or any number of other conditions in their habitat. So generally earthworms are going to be, jumping worms will be a little bit on the longer side compared to at least this particular earthworm, Lumbricus rubellus. But again, that's one that I just put up here just to share that length is not always a good indicator, because there's so much variation. However, life cycle is one that you can use. The Amenthus species that we're dealing with in the US are all annual, meaning that they hatch from cocoons, and I'll show you a photo of what a cocoon looks like in a moment. They hatch from cocoons sometime, depending on where you live, in April. Indiana might be a little bit sooner, depending on what part of Indiana you live in. But generally, by the end of April, we're probably in the Midwest, we're starting to see tiny earthworms that have hatched. It takes around 70 days or so for that earthworm to grow and mature, to become reproductively mature. And then they will start producing their own cocoons. By the end of the season, after the first hard frost, again, when that happens depends on where you live, those earthworms will start to die out, and they will not overwinter. The cocoon that they've laid during the season will be part of the life cycle that overwinters to begin the next generation. Whereas European earthworms, they have the ability to burrow into the soil. They can live for years by burrowing into the soil to avoid frost. That's not the case with jumping worms. The skin coloration is different, and the rigidity is different in jumping worms. Jumping worms tend to be, which this photo illustrates pretty well, I think, are darker than other earthworms. And their dorsal side, so their back, what we usually see when we see them, is a little darker than their belly, if you will. It's a little bit lighter, so they're kind of a two-toned coloration, whereas other earthworms are usually just kind of reddish brown. And the body makeup is also different. Jumping worms are much more rigid. They're not going to wrap themselves around your finger like other earthworms might. They're rigid, which gives them the ability to quote unquote jump, which we'll talk about later, but that's another characteristic. It's just how they feel. And then there's this clitellum, and this is probably the best way to identify adult jumping worm from any other earthworm species out there, or group out there. The clitellum is the reproductive area of the earthworm, and it's this little ring near the neck, or near the head of the jumping worm, and I'll see if I can get my cursor up. So if you see that, this is the head of the jumping worm, and this is the tail. And so this clitellum, this ring, is very close to the head. It's going to contrast from the body by being kind of a milky white. It's annular, meaning that it's a full ring around the body, goes all the way around, and it's smooth. So if you run your finger along the body, you won't be able to pick up any, any bump on the earthworm. It's at the same plane. Whereas every other earthworm that you're going to find, every other European species, has a clitellum that is farther down the body. It's not as close to the head here. It's kind of the same color as the rest of the body, kind of a pinkish red, and it's a saddle shape. So it doesn't go all the way around the body. If you were to turn this earthworm over, you'd see a space in between the two sides that don't come together. And as you can tell in this photo, it's raised from off the body, so it is a bump. So very different, very different structure to their clitellum. This is kind of academic, but again, just know that the clitellum forms on jumping worms closer to the head versus the clitellum forming farther away from the head in other species. And if you wanted to really nerd out about this, you could collect jumping worms, find a microscope, and count the number of segments from the head to where the clitellum starts. And then you would be, guaranteed to know if it's a jumping worm or not. But you can really see it just visibly without using a scope. And I mentioned behavior a little while ago. If you've seen jumping worms in action, their name gives it away as well. They are very active. They're also called snake worms because of how they will move away from you in a snake-like fashion, but they'll also kind of flop around in your hand when they're disturbed. So very active, which is why their body is more rigid. It gives them kind of a spring, I think, to jump around. Whereas other earthworms are much less active. They're kind of wiggly, as you know, but they're not going to be thrashing around necessarily. And they're not going to be worming in kind of an S-shaped fashion like a snake. So different behaviors there. Another great way to differentiate jumping worm activity from any other earthworm is how they change the structure of the soil. So if you've ever seen a forest or a garden, any kind of manicured landscape that has jumping worms, the soil will look very granular, very kind of like coffee grounds. I've heard it described as like taco meat as well. But you can pick out the individual soil particles. They're just really balled up. Whereas other earthworms like Lumbricus create these dispersed casts. So again, the casts are the earthworm's poop. That's their excrement. That's what when they feed on organic matter, they release these casts that are often high in nutrients and are often used in gardening and vermicomposting, that sort of thing. But they really change the soil structure as well. So if you have this uniform, granular soil all of a sudden, that's a red flag that you might have jumping worms in the area. And I have some photos of all of these or some movies actually that I'll show of soil and some of the behaviors. But another behavior here to end this slide is when jumping worms are handled roughly, they will often drop the last few segments of their tail in an effort to escape predation. Other earthworms, as far as I know, do not do that. So that's kind of an interesting and slightly creepy mechanism for them that just adds to their creepiness. And I have a video of that here in a moment. So, however, I'll show this slide first. I mentioned the soil. This is at the Arboretum. This is a single photo of the invasion front of Amenthus. On the left, you can see that, hopefully you can see that granularity of soil versus on the right where jumping worms had not moved into yet. So you've got more organic matter, not a lot more, but some more, But the soil looks more together. It's not as granular, at least on the surface, as where jumping worms have been working. Here's a couple of videos. So this is either jumping worms in action. Hope this works. So now this is, you won't find this high abundance normally. We've collected jumping worms and put them together for the sake of this video, but this is right after they're disturbed. And whether you have 1 or 30, this is often how they behave. I'll play that one more time. Jumping, kind of snaking around. And then, let's see, here's another example of their movement. Remember the snake movement I mentioned? And if you can see that, this is the head, this is the clitellum, and this is the tail. I'll show that one more time. And then finally here, I think this is the last video for a little bit, but watch the end of the earthworm and see what's happening to it. See the tail there? It has a little kink in it. It's moving independently, and soon the earthworm will just snap it off. And that's what they do. Now, I always get the question, are there now 2 earthworms? And the answer is no. It's still 1 earthworm. It doesn't kill the earthworm. It's still alive. It's still fine. But it just shed part of its tail. It's like some lizards have the ability to do this. They don't grow it back, but as far as we know, they are still, they're still able to grow and reproduce without this tail segment. But it could be worse. This is a photo of one of the largest earthworms in the world in Australia, the giant Gippsland earthworm. They can get up to 10 feet tall, very thick earthworms, and they're native in Australia. So the environment there has evolved with these earthworms. But can you imagine having this in your garden? That would be a lot. So things could be worse. We could having to deal with these 10-foot long earthworms. Okay. This is kind of, again, a little bit academic, but we have 3 different earthworm species that I mentioned. Metaphire are the largest ones, and Amenthus tokyoensis are the smallest ones. And given their different body sizes, they produce different size excrement or castings. So these are castings, different shapes. You can kind of see they go from large to smaller, left to right. And it's possible that whether you're in your garden and land that you're managing, you might see different size castings in kind of a uniform distribution. And you might be wondering, well, I thought they were all the same size, and that kind of thing. They can be different sizes if you have different species of jumping worms. Generally, you might not be able to detect the different sizes, and it doesn't really matter because they're all the same. It's just kind of an academic question about they do coexist together. So you might see different size castings, but they're all jumping worms. And then cocoons. Cocoons are, again, the part of the life cycle that overwinters. They are about 2 millimeters in size. You can see with the scale of the penny, they're very small, slightly oblong, and generally brown. They look just like soil. They're very difficult to see in the soil. It took us quite a while to figure out how to isolate them from the soil to do work on them. And so we have a system set up of soil collecting and wet sieving that soil to isolate the cocoons. The cocoons do sink in water, which is nice because much of the organic matter will not sink, will float. And so we can kind of titrate off the other materials, and then we're left, if there are cocoons, they're left in the bottom of our bucket. But they're very hard to see in the environment. They stick to soil, and so we think this might be part of the life cycle that is actually spreading around the landscape easily because they're so hard to see and so easy to miss. This is a new hatchling, so cocoons to a new hatchling. Generally, they're around 1 centimeter or 2 in length. When they are first born, they are pigmented. There are some earthworms that you will see early in the year that are almost the same length. They are completely clear, however. They're called potworms. But they threw us off when we were first learning about this group. They threw us off because we thought they were jumping worm hatchlings, because they have this behavior of whipping their tails around in the soil. They're very small, and they don't grow any bigger than a few centimeters, but they're not pigmented, and so they're not jumping worms. And we realized then that jumping worms, once we started to hatch them, they are born pigmented. And so we often don't see them in the soil because they blend in well until they get a little bit larger. Okay, so why should we be concerned about these? Well, in terms of forests, we know a lot about European earthworms. They've been well studied. The effects of European earthworms have been documented that include some things I've talked about: significant reduction to the litter layer in forests, loss of native plant diversity, and subsequent increases in invasive plants that come into that disturbed environment, drastic changes in soil nutrients, loss of nutrients. And the reason why I mention this, because we think the effects of Amenthus and what we're seeing is that they are similar to European species, but even potentially more dramatic, because their ability to spread is probably quicker because of their parthenogenesis. They don't need a mate to reproduce. And their cocoons, they lay so many cocoons every year that they're easy for us to spread unknowingly from site to site in our shoes, on our tools, on our car tires, etc. So that's the main reason why in forests we're concerned about them. Now, some of you might be asking this question, but wait, forever I've been told that earthworms are good for my garden. So what's the deal? Are these not good for my garden? And the answer, of course, is yes and no. So urban gardens compared to forests are a much different ecosystem. Whether you're talking about urban gardens or even large-scale ag, they often have compacted soil, and especially over time, they need amendments to that soil, whether it's nutrients, organic matter, soil structure changes. And earthworms, especially deep dwelling earthworms like the common nightcrawler, can provide those services. They can create tunnels that allow aeration and infiltration and moisture to reach lower levels of the soil. Earthworms eat organic matter, and they will bring that organic matter down into the soil. They produce these nutrient-rich castings that we've talked about. And if they're burrowing down, they're bringing those castings with them, and they're mixing the soil and mixing the nutrients in with the soil. That can be really good for gardens, vegetable gardens or flower gardens. They have a lot of plant nutrients like phosphorus, calcium, nitrogen, magnesium, all important for plant growth. However, and you knew this was coming, jumping worms are a different story. As we talked about, they are not deep burrowers. They do not create pore space in the soil because they're only doing their work in the same area. They're either in the leaf litter itself or whatever organic matter you have, or they're just under the soil. So they're not effective at aerating the soil. In some cases, they can create too much pore space at that top layer because they're constantly working it, creating those smaller soil aggregates, and that can have the effect of drying the soil out. And jumping worms can, they create a very loose and thus erodible topsoil. That's even though it's primarily made up of nutrient-rich castings. Again, they're not transporting those castings anywhere. And if the soil becomes erodible because it's so loose, all the nutrients in those castings might be washed downhill otherwise leached from the system. And so what you end up doing or seeing is over time, you could see a net loss of soil nutrients. And then again, in terms of going back to the soil structure, the actual soil is so loose, it can be really challenging to get new plants established. There's just not very much soil to root contact. At the Arboretum, we've had a challenge of getting new, even native plants established in this kind of soil. There's just not enough structure in the soil to hold on to those roots. And it's challenging not only for established plants, but for new plants. And I mentioned, think of, even though these earthworms, jumping worms, are creating nutrients in their castings, those nutrients, due to their phenology, when they're really consuming organic matter, it's not early in the spring, it's late in the summer when they're at their highest abundance. They're all adults, and so think of like end of August, September, when they're really creating all these nutrients, not necessarily when plants need them to grow. So the timing is off a little bit, and because they're creating them all at the same time, they're very susceptible to those nutrients being lost from that site, whether it's just erosion. You get a heavy rainstorm and that soil mobilizes downhill with cocoon potentially, and with the nutrients that are tied up in those castings. So you can think of it as kind of a quick release fertilizer, which can be a good thing if applied at the right time, but in this case you tend to have a net loss of nutrients. And we've even seen evidence of at high abundance earthworms can destroy turfgrass. They can eat the fine roots. Whether or not they're living in the turfgrass or not, they can certainly move there and create havoc. And then we've seen evidence of them eating plant roots, fine roots. So how do they spread? And this might be a review for some of you, I'm sure, but compost is one of those areas that we have definitely seen a correlation with organic compost being moved around, whether it's in your garden or municipalities, spreading around different beds. They like organic matter. Compost is perfect. We've seen them in wood mulch, compost. They are, again, since they're in that upper layer of soil or in the leaves themselves, fall leaf pickup by municipalities. You're raking all the leaves into a central location in the road, potentially, I should say, with cocoons, maybe even adult earthworms here. Those are being taken into a truck and brought to a central location and then redistributed for municipal projects or purchase or given away to neighborhoods. And that's just one way they can potentially be spread. Again, probably cocoons at this time of year. Plant sales is one thing that we've talked a lot about, especially here in Wisconsin. Garden clubs, societies, plant sales are really valuable, not only to fund the group, but also as a community building exercise, community engagement. And a lot of societies and groups have canceled their plant sales in fear of spreading jumping worms. At the Arboretum, our Friends group holds an annual plant sale, and they've continued with they've continued with the plant sale, but they've made drastic changes. They no longer allow the public to dig up plants in their yard and bring them to the sale. We just can't be sure that their properties are not infested. So they only purchase wholesale from reputable nurseries that they've worked with for a while. We will check the soil of all the pots to make sure they don't look like a granular soil. All of the plants brought in are placed on pallets, wooden pallets, so there's no ground contact with the pots. And so there are definitely ways that you can still hold these sales, invite the community in, and be pretty confident that your material that you're providing is not going to add to the spread of this invasive species. And so there's, I can talk more about that if there's questions about that. Nurseries, obviously, we've worked a lot with nurseries in Wisconsin. They know about jumping worms. It's in their best interest not to have them, but just the nature of that business, working with soil and plants, organic matter, earthworms are around. And so they have taken precautions, having everything on pallets like you see here. Making sure they're using either a soilless medium, or the soil that they're getting is from an area that is free jumping worms. And it's been our experience that, nurseries and greenhouses take it very seriously, because it's their business and people will ask them questions. And so we've had really good luck working with nurseries to bring in plants for our plant sales and for our restorations. Landscaping companies, those kind of operations that or anyone, land manager working with tools, lawnmowers, trucks, this is for any invasive species. Arriving clean to a site and leaving clean is really important. Carry a boot brush with you to brush off your shoes, clean your tires. These are things that we do at the Arboretum. But you can imagine how invasive seeds, cocoons, or jumping worms can be caught in your boot tread or on your tires and spread. So it's an easy way to spread them, but also an easy way to ensure that you're not just brushing or cleaning off your tools. This is always kind of a scary photo for people to look at, but fishing bait, obviously for a long time, at least in Wisconsin, Minnesota, I know. The DNRs here have had a campaign for years to, not discard your unused fishing bait in the woods. This goes for any earthworm species. So making sure that if you're buying earthworms, that you're not buying jumping worms. People shouldn't be selling them, but you can readily get them on the internet from other places. So if you do use them for bait, make sure that you are throwing them away in the garbage and not just throwing them in the woods or in the water. Okay, so sorry. What are some steps that we can take? So in Wisconsin, we've developed a series of what's called best management practices, and other states are developing their own, but they're all pretty similar at this point. And the whole idea is, how can we go about our business, gardening, landscaping, creating compost, and at the same time do what we can to stop the spread of this new invasive species. And the first one is to watch for jumping worms and sign to their presence. The second one is to educate yourself and others to recognize what they look like. And so these two taken together, by you all being at this talk, for example, you've taken these steps. You're educating yourself what to look for. You can share this knowledge with your neighbors, with your colleagues, and you have a better idea of what to look for and signs of this new invasive species. Education is always the first step. When you can, only use, sell, plant, purchase, trade, landscaping, and gardening materials that appear to be free of jumping worms. Now this is a lot to ask. This can be really hard. But the idea here is just, since you know what to look for, you can ask questions of retailers or of your landscaping company. Do you know about jumping worms? Do you know, have you worked in areas that have them? Is this product clean? Is this soil clean? Is this mulch from an area that doesn't have jumping worms? Those kind of questions. And that's really the best that we can do. And if you're buying live plants from nurseries, just inspect the soil. If it looks like it's intact, then I would say then you're in good shape. Compost. In Wisconsin, we have part of our in our and our rule is for commercial composters, have to follow temperature regulations for their compost piles to eliminate harmful pathogen and bacteria. And so in Wisconsin, and actually I want to say 30 or so states have very similar standards. Commercial composters have to have their piles reach 133 degrees or 131 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, for a period of 3 or 10 days, depending on the type of pile that they're working with. And we know, and I'll mention a study a little bit later, that the temperature that those entities are using to reduce pathogens and bacteria also kill earthworms for sure, but also render the cocoons non-viable. So as long as as long as you have equal distribution of heat throughout that pile over a couple of days, you can be pretty confident that that compost is going to be earthworm cocoon free. Now, the challenge is, how do you know if you go to a store and you pick up a bag of compost if it's been treated that way? It might say on the label. Otherwise, if you know that it's been produced in Wisconsin, then you can assume that it is been treated to that. But you can also, if you have the ability to create compost on site using your own leaves, for instance, that's the best thing to do, is to keep everything on your yard, not rake it to the street. If you're gardening and need that mulch, that material to create compost on site, and try and get it to that temperature, maybe use solarization techniques. We'll talk more about that, but just know that, check with your state in terms of their compost regulations. And if you're buying within state, you likely will be okay in terms of that compost material. And I already mentioned this: arrive clean, leave clean. Make sure that your equipment, your vehicle tires, personal gear are clean. There is a way that, this is not a control, but there is a way that you can determine, two things: what earthworms you have on your site, and if those include jumping worms. It's a really simple procedure that's been around for a long time. What's cool about it is that it's a standardized research technique, but it's also used by K-12 educators, by the public, as a way to monitor earthworms on your site. So what it is creating this mustard water solution. So you mix a 1/3 cup of dry mustard powder that you can buy anywhere. It doesn't have to be spicy mustard, just regular mustard powder. Mix it with a gallon of water. Go out to your backyard, rake away some leaves so you have a direct soil content or contact. Pour roughly half of that gallon over a square foot of soil. For jumping worms, you can have a larger area. So jumping worms don't burrow deeply. The reason why you pour half is to saturate the soil, and then you put the other half, and that'll infiltrate deeper to get the deeper dwelling earthworms. But for jumping worms in particular, you can just pour it on the surface in a larger area, and if they're there, they will come to the surface. And what's happening is that it doesn't hurt the earthworms, doesn't hurt the plants. It acts as a skin irritant. Earthworms, they more or less, they breathe through their skin, through pores in their skin. And so this mustard is kind of it's kind of a spice to them, if you will. It's not the right word, but it irritates their skin. And so their reaction is to burrow vertically to get out of that soil. And so it's kind of analogous to when you have a heavy rain and the day after you see earthworms scattered around on the sidewalks. It's a little bit of a different mechanism there. Their soil is saturated and they're more or less drowning, so they have to get out, and their reaction is to go vertically to get out. This is kind of the same, but it's just we're making it happen quicker. We're adding a little spice. And so if you have a very small infestation, this could be a control. where you just are physically picking out earthworms. But really, it's not meant for that. It's just meant for you to determine if you have what earthworms you have. And here's a video of this in action. Here's the mustard solution being poured over. Now watch upper left, you see some action, and all of a sudden, here it comes. Here comes one out of the surface. And then you just pick them up. And there, if you're really into monitoring what you have, you can count how many earthworms are in that area, how many different species. Let me show you that again and make sure that you can see that these are all jumping worms. You can see the clitellum on these worms. But really, you can just tell, hey, do I have jumping worms or not? And again, it doesn't hurt the earthworms. So you can, that one thrashed, you can see the white clitellum. This one coming up right now, you can see it really well. All right, so in terms of control, we're just starting to collect more data on control efforts, and there is no silver bullet, but there's a couple options that some of you have probably heard about that I'll run through kind of quick here. First would be the chemical controls. There was an organic fertilizer called Early Bird that was manufactured for a long time and for golf courses to use. It's a low nitrogen fertilizer that had these naturally produced plant saponins, which are defense chemicals that many plants produce. In this case, it was from the Chinese tea seed tree. And it was a byproduct of creating tea seed oil, which is a common oil in Asian cooking. And the byproduct was put in this fertilizer. And what it did for golf course managers was that it fertilized their grass and also killed earthworms. Because earthworms, generally create, at least the European earthworms, create these little mounds of cast, and you don't want to have a bumpy green or a fairway. So they've been using this for decades, especially down in like the southeast part of the country, Kentucky, Tennessee area. We've done some pilot work with this. There's a liquid formulation and a granular formulation. Excuse me. It definitely decreases the abundance of jumping worms, adults, very well. However, it does not seem to affect cocoons. So that's one thing to know. So this is not a one-off solution. You'd have to have probably multiple years of application. And what I want to emphasize here are two things. There's not been much research on this product or any chemical really on jumping worms. Especially on residual impact to other native soil biota or beneficial organisms, whether that's, amphibians to mycorrhizal fungi, we don't know. So definitely some caution with this. Plus, it is not labeled for, it's not a worm, a wormicide. It's an off-label use. One of the reasons why actually this company has stopped manufacturing it. There are other, there's a similar product called Castaway, but it's not something that I'm not suggesting that anyone necessarily uses this because it is off-label, especially if you're going to use it broadly. I would not recommend that. It can be used in conjunction with other things potentially, but we just don't know a lot about the residual impacts especially to like garden systems. So what we're trying to do though is, since it's not the fertilizer that we want, it's the saponins in the fertilizer. And so there is some research going on about looking at other crops like alfalfa, other plant-based material that we can extract saponins and create a direct saponin mixture without the added nitrogen that we could use for control. Biochar has been studied before for European earthworms that has shown the ability to reduce numbers. There hasn't been a lot of work on biochar or diatomaceous earth as physical controls. We've done a little work with this in the lab, and we found that we didn't really we didn't mix the biochar or diatoms into the soil, and so earthworms were just avoiding the topsoil. They would just stay below, and so without mixing it, you're not going to see much effect. They can just stay out of that space. So I think there's potential there, but we did need some more research. Plus, you're going to change the soil carbon, probably pH, when you add some of these type of material. So I mentioned about the heat, especially with composting. My colleague Marie Johnston and I did some work on this last year and found that at even lower temperatures, at 104 degrees Fahrenheit, no jumping worm cocoons were viable. So you don't even have to get it up to the 131 degrees Fahrenheit. You can, at 104 degrees for 3 days, it was sufficient to kill all cocoons. The challenge, of course, is how do we apply this research to our garden or to our greenhouse? And that's where we're really looking for probably folks like you that are working with gardens, with natural areas, with horticulture, to experiment with different ways of applying this heat, whether it's solarization in the spring, putting down clear or black plastic to get temperatures up that high. I'm not going to suggest propane torches, but I just said it, so that's one way you could do it. Again, I'm not recommending that for obvious reasons, but at small scale, that might be something that could work for some people. Again, getting your compost up to that temperature, and then applying it. So we're trying to think of ways, in the lab or greenhouse, you might have some sterilization techniques that could work, that kind of thing. So we know that temperature will work. It's just how do we apply it? And here's, again, I already mentioned this in Wisconsin, the regulation of composters. We do know that prescribed fire will reduce the viability of jumping worm cocoons. This is a study down in Georgia several years ago. And these were, think of like savanna fires, kind of slow creeping ground fires. And what's interesting is that adult earthworms were not impacted by fire in this setting because they were able to burrow down just a little bit under the soil. And since soil is a great heat buffer, they were not impacted. But cocoons that are laid in the soil, on top of the soil, in the litter, they were burned up. They obviously can't move. So that's an interesting find. And again, it just shows that fire will work, high temperatures will work. It's just how to apply it on your setting. So coming to the end here of the talk, but things that we can consider. So, consider reducing the amount of wood mulch applied to your garden. That's not always possible because mulch is really important for gardens, horticultural settings. But again, just understand that organic matter in many forms is food for earthworms, and so you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of reducing the amount of mulch and finding that happy medium. Potentially look at different mulch sources. Purchase mulch from reputable sources, first of all, that you work with. Experiment with different mulch, like pine needles, hay, maybe native grass mulch. We just wrapped up an experiment looking at different mulch types, from sugar maple, oak litter, to pine litter, and then C4 grasses. And we're just crunching the data now, but not all organic matter is created the same, right? They have different carbon content, but also whatever you put down on your soil may affect that soil. Pine may increase the acidity, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's worth experimenting with different types of mulch that may be more or less palatable to earthworms. but provide the same benefits. And then again, I mentioned this before, experiment with heat applications. So a few resources to share. The Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has a great website dedicated just to jumping worms. It's one of the better ones that I've seen. Minnesota DNR has one now too. It's also very good. And Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. I don't know what the extension or DNR has, but I'm guessing there are some resources there as well. Our website has some. And then there's an organization called the Great Lakes Worm Watch that's based in Duluth, Minnesota, that has been really the go-to for everything earthworms for a long time. And they are now providing more and more content on jumping worms. They have the recipe for that mustard pour, how to put it together, how to apply it. So if you need more information on that, this is a great website to go check out. And with that, that's the end of my spiel. So I'm happy to stay on for a while and take any questions.
Well, thank you, Brad. Yes, we have questions. So I will start from the beginning here. One of the questions is, and it was earlier on in your talk, and Mike wants to know, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the slide was, but he asked the question, is it heavily infested by any earthworms or AJWs? Yeah, I'm not quite sure what was going. This was about 11:10 into your. This is about 10 minutes into your talk. That so maybe we'll just come back to that later. We can.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what that question.
Let's see. Phil asked, does each cocoon contain one worm?
Good question. Yeah. Usually they do. Sometimes we do find twins. But probably 90% of cocoons just have one earthworm. And just to add to that, there might be another question about this, but I'll just say that we don't know necessarily how many cocoons are produced per earthworm per season. It might not be that many, but just given the number of individual earthworms, it becomes a lot of cocoons per year. And what we're finding out now is that there is some proportion of cocoons that will not hatch in the given year that they're laid, but will hatch the year later or a second year later. And so think of these cocoons as forming a cocoon bank, similar to a seed bank, at least for a few years. And so that's why there's not going to be a one-off control probably that will, unless you really torch the site, that will mitigate the spread or mitigate the reproduction of earthworms. We have a study going on now where we have these plots that we've put up these metal exclosures, and we've been removing earthworm for 2 years without any new inputs of earthworm. So they're not able to get in or out. And we started last year. We removed all the earthworms, and we still had hundreds of new earthworms this year without any adults laying additional cocoons. And so once they get in there at high abundance and start laying cocoons, their presence can last for a while.
Okay, Terry asks, do jumping worms survive or thrive in aquatic or riparian areas that are prone to flooding?
That is a good question. We don't think so, actually. They don't seem to do well in aquatic environments, riparian environments that do see flooding periodically. The soil type is usually fine for them, that more hydric soil, but if it's flooded regularly, they're not going to do well. We have not found them in near like water courses, no.
All right, Mary asks, how about shallow plowing to turn up the cocoons to freezing winter weather in agricultural settings? Would that work as far as?
That's another good question. So one we don't know a lot about like larger agricultural settings like cropland. We don't know what's happening in those areas, if jumping worms are there or not. I'm very interested in hearing from folks if they're working those systems. Like we know, like community gardens have them, smaller gardens, but gardens with or landscapes with tillage, it's possible that our harsh temperatures might freeze the cocoons and kill them. However, you know, these earthworms are up in Canada now. There's a couple areas in Canada, southern Canada, obviously, that are persisting. However, there's with snow cover, that snow obviously is buffering the temperature effect. So yeah, if you didn't have snow cover and you had cocoons open to freezing temperatures for winter, I'd be very interested if they would survive. I would probably think not, but it hasn't been done.
We have three questions that all kind of ask the same thing here. Is there the distribution in the lake states known and the rate of spread?
Yeah, so distribution in the lake states. So they're in almost every county in Wisconsin. They're very prevalent in Michigan and Minnesota. That's area that I work primarily, so I know that Northern Illinois for sure. And so they're widely distributed. They're correlated with urban environment right now. That could be because that's where people are looking for them, but also, you know, a lot of this compost, horticulture, manicured land exists where we're less material around. So the next step is to look into more rural areas, which we are finding them too, but definitely in urban areas. And rate of spread, we don't have a great sense for that. It really depends on particular sites, I think. At the Arboretum, in the forest areas that we're looking, however, we have some areas that are on kind of wooded slopes, and we've recorded in one between two growing seasons an increase of, I always forget the number, but multiple acres of new invasion over a course of one season. However, I think that's probably unusual. What we saw was that we'd get these heavy storm events, and like I mentioned, the soil is very erodible, and we'd get soil moving down footpaths or down hills, and likely taking with it cocoons and just moving them that way down the slope. If you don't have that grade and it's just flat, earthworms themselves are not going to be moving acres every year, I don't think. It's more of, other conditions have to be in play.
Okay. Mike Hogan says that a reporting website through Ohio State University Extension has been started for people who want to, report that are seeing these worms. So just so you know that. Let's see.
And maybe while you're looking, I'll add one more comment to that. So there's a lot of states have their own reporting, which is great. For those of you that are into apps and citizen science type efforts, there's a couple apps. One called EdMaps, which is a invasive species reporting app. In the Great Lakes, there's GLEDN, the Great Lakes Early Detection Network. They both feed in together. Minnesota is using these apps to track distribution in Minnesota. So, what I'm encouraging folks to do is report to their state extension or DNR or whatever folks have set up. And then if they are involved in these other sites, also report them on this more public, platform. And that data is really valuable for researchers to quickly get a snapshot of the map and other land managers.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Are there any? Oops, somebody jumped on here and I lost my spot. Are there any native or non-native plants that produce saponins in amounts large enough to possibly reduce jumping worm adult numbers?
So that is something that I don't know. I know that I mentioned like alfalfa as a crop that has high levels of saponins. I've seen some data. It's sort of the data is inconclusive on how it works in terms of its effect on jumping worm, but there's more research going on there. Um, I know that quinoa actually is very high in saponins. It's usually before it's before it's packaged, it's heavily washed. To part of the reason is to remove those saponins. And so I've been talking with some folks about, hey, how can we get that byproduct wash and use that as a source. But I really don't know. I haven't looked into the data on saponin levels in different plants. So that's something that I'm sure some people on this call probably have a much better idea than I do.
Okay. Is anyone trying fall prescribed burns when adults would have less opportunity to produce more cocoons, assuming that cocoon laying is fairly continuous until adults die in the annual cycle?
Yeah, that's a great idea, and it's definitely an interesting study that has been talked about. So no, from what I know, no one's done that particular study, but that's out there waiting to happen, and I think would be a great study. It'd be especially for a larger scale look at the upper Midwest of oak savanna habitats, areas with and without jumping worms, and it'd be a nice study to have. I think that would be to get that kind of data on prescribed fire in those habitats would be really valuable. So not being done as far as I know, but hopefully will be soon.
Okay. Brent says last year we had a Japanese beetle grub problem on our lawn that had devastated large areas of our grass. We used a Japanese beetle grub treatment on it, and while it did take care of the grubs, we had hundreds of jumping worms also die from the treatment. Of course, it is a chemical treatment. I'm curious if there has been any work on grub treatments being cross-applied for control of jumping worms.
Not that I know of, but I would guess there have been. I haven't seen anything scientific literature, but that doesn't mean that people haven't tried it. Yeah, and there's probably a lot of chemicals that will affect jumping worms, whether it's sort of off use or residual effect when other non-target effect. So yeah, that's not super surprising that would also impact jumping worms, which is good to hear. So yeah, but no studies that I know that have confirmed that. But if you're seeing that, then that's good evidence.
Okay. Joe asked, do they have a preference for certain soil pH levels?
It doesn't appear to be. We do know that they can change the pH of the soil. We have a study that we just finished that showed that between non-invaded areas and invaded areas, the pH was lower, so more acidic where the jumping worms were. But there's not a lot of, from what I know, they don't necessarily prefer a certain pH. But I just don't know the answer to that. I do know that they will change the pH.
Okay. Lee says European earthworms can often be found on the surface of pavements after heavy rains. Do jumping worm species often seek dry areas after heavy rains as well?
That's a good question too. I have not seen that phenomenon with jumping worms for whatever reason. It's not unheard of, but it's certainly not like the mass exodus that you see with European earthworms, right, on sidewalks and roads after heavy rains. So I don't know if they just can hang out on the surface of the lawn or soil and be fine. But it's a great question, yeah, and one that I hadn't really thought about very much. But
I think you're gonna have to get a crowd together and start working on some of these. Start getting some of these other Lake State universities involved. There's a
I
lot of
tell you,
things people
yeah.
are asking, isn't there?
Yeah.
Oh dear. Okay, and you're just one person.
It's a lot of interest, yeah.
Exactly. Um, uh, Deborah asks, are there any predators for the Asian jumping worms?
Yeah. So there are, kind of the usual suspects. Birds will eat earthworms in general. Robins and turkeys will eat them. Um, some amphibians will eat them. Salamanders, toads will eat them. But and this is earthworms in general. There's nothing that we've seen that are specific to jumping worms. There are some flathead worms that will eat them, but there's no, I guess none of the predation levels are high enough to impact the population. So that's one thing to note. And it's very little research on this question, other than I guess there's some work on salamanders and toads, but very little on other species. So things we eat, not enough to probably dent the population.
Okay. Thomas says, I had a nursery grower that claims jumping worms reduce the soil mass in a pot by 1/3. Is that reasonable, or does it make sense?
It does, yeah. It depends on what the soil, if it was a mostly organic soil, they can definitely, that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, they can definitely, especially if they're in a pot where that's all they have to feed on, they'll eat all the organic matter and potentially eat some of the soil as well. So, yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me.
Okay. You say Gregory says soil without jumping worms has less organic matter. Where does the organic matter go? Jumping worms die over the winter in northern zones?
Can you say that again, Robin?
Okay, hold on.
Sorry.
He says that you say that, and this would have been around 11. Let's see. Soil without jumping worms has less organic matter. And then he asks, where does the organic matter go? Do jumping worms die over the winter in northern zones?
Yeah, so jumping worms will die in the winter in northern zones. I mean, they'll die. They're species. Like they will, even under ideal, they will time out. Like they will not persist for, as far as I can see or have heard or known. They don't persist regardless of temperature. They're strongly an annual species. So yeah, I mean, jumping worm infested areas, they will consume a lot of the leaf litter. But what's interesting is that all earthworms do that. And so what's challenging, especially in forested areas, is to out the impacts of European earthworm as a group versus these new jumping worms that are from Asia, completely different type of earthworm. And what is the biggest difference in between litter depth, litter mass between areas that of these two earthworms? Because we're getting to the point where there's very few, except for maybe some New England areas, there's very few hardwood forests that don't have some level of earthworm invasion. Maybe northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, there's some areas, but very few at this point. And so a lot of the forests have already been worked by European species, like I mentioned earlier, with similar changes, but potentially not as drastic. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I guess that's all I can say about that at this point.
Okay. Now, Carl asks, what are jumping worms' ecological role / function in their native habitats? You may have asked that or answered that already.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's a good question. And, along with that, I often get the question of like, what keeps them in check in their native habitats, or are they invasive? And from what we know, there's they never get to the abundance in their native habitats as we're seeing here. That's what the literature suggests. There's many different species that coexist, and whether they're kept in check, they're kept in check somehow. Either whether it's just the amount of space available for the species. In theory, they're doing the same type of soil engineering. They're working the soil the same way, but there's not as many of them in terms of like per unit that we're seeing in these invaded areas in North America. So the change is probably less pronounced in terms of structural changes and chemistry. But something else to keep in mind is that the areas where they're native to, they've been there all along. Like those systems are adapted to earthworm manipulation. And so whatever changes they're making are, in theory, benefiting the habitat at large or the ecosystem at large. Whereas here, it's modifying the ecosystem in a way that tends to be a negative or a destructive, reducing the health of these forests. So it's just a different process over there and different impacts.
Okay. Gregory says he has jumping worms on some property that he maintains. He's wondering about how to economically clean truck tires, trailer tires, and treads of his shoes. Washing shovels and rakes is easily done, but the whole process is going to take considerable time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there and maybe do you know of an economical way to do this? I guess is what he's asking.
Yeah. So in terms of your boots or your shoes, basically it's just a boot brush, like a small boot brush, have in the back of your pocket, brush off your shoe before you leave. One thing that we do know is that the cocoons do not seem to be able to stick by themselves to tread or to metal or whatever, but they stick to the soil. And so if you've gotten the soil off, then you're in pretty good shape. For us, it's just like a hose with a nozzle and just spraying down the tires, spraying your tools, which we do anyways, even before jumping worms came on the scene. Now, the one thing, and if you're able to do that on site before you move, that's the best. Obviously, you don't want to bring dirty tools to a new site and then do the work. If you can capture the, and this is challenging. If you can somehow capture, if you are like off-site now in a central location, you can capture that. If you're spraying tools and stuff, you can capture the runoff and get rid of, let the cocoons sink to the bottom and then get rid of the water and throw the cocoon into the garbage. That's great. But I think the main thing is like if they're already there on site, if you can stay close to that site, do the washing, do the boot brushing, and then leave. That's the kind of the best case scenario. But there's no, some people are doing like bleach applications and that kind of thing, and I don't think that has any impact. It's not impacting the cocoons. It's more chemicals. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's just physically removing the soil particles.
Okay. Elizabeth asks, I think of cocoons as a later stage of Lepidoptera. Are these cocoons really a first stage or early stage, more like an egg? Are they born alive and then make a cocoon?
Yeah, they're more like an egg. That's correct. So, and the egg produces live young, and then the adults produce the new cocoon. So I think thinking they're not similar. They're not exactly eggs, but they're more like eggs. So that's a good way to think about it, if that helps.
Okay. What was the mode of action of the early bird fertilizer in killing the worms?
Yeah, so it is that saponin chemical.
Okay.
Now, the actual mechanism, like what is in the saponins that is actually killing them, I guess I don't know the answer to that. other than, these are naturally produced chemicals as for plant defense. So they're designed to defend plants against herbivory and, other harmful organisms or bacteria, fungi. So that's the mechanism, how that's the active ingredient, I guess, that is doing the work on the worms, we think. But deeper than that, I guess I don't know.
Okay. Ron wants to know if jumping worms are related to the red wigglers.
No, they are different. Red wigglers are European species, very common in vermiculture. So those are definitely different earthworms. Those are European, not jumping worms.
Okay. You might have answered this. Are there any native or non-native plants that produce saponins in large enough possibility to reduce?
Yeah, I think I tried to address that one. Yeah.
Yep. Sorry, I've been reading and trying to listen.
Yeah, no.
Multitasking. Thank you. I'm glad. All righty. Okay. Do you have any idea about the distribution of these in New England? I think you touched on that, mainly the Midwest before, but
yeah. So I've been working actually quite a bit in New England. There's a lot of active research and management right now in New England, particularly Vermont, New York, Connecticut. I'm working with some folks. We just developed a new group called J-Worm. It's a research and management working group, just within this year. So hopefully you'll be hearing more about that group. But they're distributed far and wide. New York Parks has them bad. I think Adirondacks, Green Mountain, White Mountains, they're around, but there are forests in New England that don't have them either, and so it's a similar story, I think, to the Midwest. But New England had them before the Midwest did. They've been coming up the eastern seaboard to the New England, and then kind of arcing to the west, and sort of that's been kind of their spread in the last decade, is coming from New England to the west.
Okay. Let's see. Do you know how the 131 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 3 days for Wisconsin composters is verified? Can this be done in a kiln or through other?
Well, so our Department of Agriculture, Transportation, and Consumer Protection is the regulatory arm of the industry, and so we have an agency that certifies them, those commercial entities, and oversees, does checks on nurseries and greenhouses for invasive species in general. Not every one, of course, but they're the inspectors, I guess, and do the certification. So we have an agency that we've been involved with.
Okay. Has anyone tried chickens or Muscovy ducks to control jumping worms?
I don't know. I don't know. Write that one down.
Well, there's a possibility.
I like it.
Okay. Are you finding any jumping worms in agricultural production fields, especially those bordering on forest areas?
Yeah, that's actually that is on my short list of research projects. I think it's a great question. Okay. And the answer is no. We don't have data or good data on that. But that's something that I'd like to look into. Is that is those like fence row between ag fields? Are they harbingers of jumping worms? And if so, are they like a source for ag fields, for example, or is it the opposite? We don't have any information really on ag, large scale ag. So that's a great question.
Okay. Have you come across jumping worms being sold for vermiculture?
I've sort of anecdotally heard that they are or can be. I don't have any specific instances of that.
Okay.
I think it's more like red wigglers are kind of the common ones used, but they're probably also used. Jumping worms are probably also used in that industry. I don't have a lot of experience with that.
Okay. That was from Joe Bogdan. He says he says this has happened in Ohio.
Hmm.
So just so you know.
Okay.
Yeah. She's Lorette says, just an FYI, my sister who lives in Syosset, New York, had jumping worms in her compost pile about 2 years ago. She had no idea what they were and asked me about it. She ended up dumping it all in black bags to heat it up, and so far so good. They have not
Hey,
returned.
perfect.
And she lived in
Good.
a regular neighborhood with a small yard. Luckily, she noticed them before dumping the compost through her garden. So, see, people are out there looking for those things
That's
for sure.
great. Yeah, and that's another, in terms of control, like that's like the perfect situation there where they identified it and putting them in plastic bags in the sun for a couple days or even a couple hours actually, and then disposing them like you would like garlic mustard or other noxious weeds in the trash. That's what we recommend in Wisconsin too. Is just removing that material in a closed bag.
I'll get rid of them. Okay. And Catherine asks, are jumping worms likely to survive in highly sandy soils, such as occurring in the oak openings region?
Yeah, definitely less likely. Yeah, we don't find them often in that kind of in the sandier, siltier habitats. Yeah, there's just not as much organic matter probably for them to consume. I mean, they if there's they will eat obviously oak litter. I don't think it's preferable to like a more music maple woods, but so it isn't that they couldn't persist there, but I don't think they would do as well. And we don't find them in very often in like sandy or oak opening habitats or pine barrens.
Okay. How long after they hatch do the worms start to produce cocoons?
Yeah, we it's around 70 days or so, 70 to 80 days, I think, is kind of the range where they become sexually mature. They have that full clitellum, and so in theory, they can produce cocoons, 2.5 months or so, 3 months after they hatch. So, and that's the thing too. So if they hatched, in April, let's say mid-April, and they're producing cocoons early July, you can actually get 2 generations in 1 year. And so even though the second generation won't live long, if they're producing cocoons, that's just adding to that cocoon bank over time.
Okay, we're getting down to the end here. Would fire ants affect populations? I don't know.
I'm gonna write that down. I have no idea. To study.
Yeah, there you go.
Good question.
Okay, let's see. I'm gonna slaughter this word. I noticed that early in midsummer, the AJW on my property didn't have any tellums at all. Is that what that word
Okay.
is? They didn't seem to form until August and after. I guess that was it's just an observation here, but I thought I would.
Yeah. So yeah, the jumping worms forming clitellums later in the summer than maybe we would think. That yeah, again, I think a lot of it depends on when they hatched, and so it could have been that they were hatching late on that particular year, that particular site, and so they didn't form them early. And the clitellums, like it's possible that even if they're not like fully that milky white fully formed, that they could still be sexually mature. We don't know exactly. Like we just know that that they for sure are mature, and they for sure can produce cocoons when that clitellum is fully formed. It could be slightly before full formation, and it could be that it takes longer sometimes to form the cocoon or to form the clitellum. So I think there's always variation.
Okay. Let's see if we've got any more here. Okay, this is the last one for the questions. Have you heard any concerns with hammerhead worms. I don't know if that's even
Hammerhead
related
worms.
to this, but anyway.
So yeah, I'm not familiar with that very much. I think I've
Okay.
heard of hammerhead worm. I think they're actually, I don't know if they're earthworms or if they're more of a nematode. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, I can't really address that too well. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. Hold on just a sec. Do the jumping worms ever actually sexually reproduce? Is it necessary?
They do. Yeah, they can definitely sexually reproduce. And so they have their choice. they can reproduce in a
Oh,
variety of
no.
ways.
That's
Yeah,
not good.
yeah. No. No.
Okay. From there, let me see, just let me double check here.
Mhm.
Okay. I think we're good.
Okay.
And folks, again, I tried to hit all of the questions, but if I missed yours, please know we had quite a few here. You will have Gregory's email on the email that you will get tomorrow, so you can contact him with your questions if you have any more.
Mhm.
I want to thank you for all this information. As you can see, we may have to have you in again after you do research on all of the questions you've been asked and all the you got your work cut out for you here. It sounds like for a few years. So
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of interest and a lot of
yeah.
need for information. So yeah, I'm happy to come back sometime.
Yeah. All right. That sounds good. Folks, you will be getting an email from me tomorrow just to double, to tell you, like I did in the intro, that you will be getting an email from me tomorrow with Greg's contact info, information on how to get CEUs, and also a survey that we want you to fill out if you possibly could so that we can keep these webinars coming. I appreciate everyone's questions and interest, and I really appreciate Brad coming on here
Mhm.
and doing this presentation. It's like you say, this is probably one of the longest presentations we've ended with a Q&A afterwards. So there's a lot of interest.
Yeah.
Glad to hear from everybody. Brad, thank you again so much for this information. And folks, I'm going to close the webinar. And again, you will be getting an email from us tomorrow. Thank you very much.